In a world where a single corporation buys and sells human life like inventory, where a virus turns a sleeping city into a graveyard that walks, the survivors have only one prayer: to last until dawn. But what if, on the night Raccoon City fell, something else fell with it? Not a monster, not a weapon, a man, a bored, ordinary man, who has never in his life met anything he could not end with a single punch. Tonight, Umbrella's greatest horrors, the tyrants, the hordes, the relentless Nemesis, come face to face with the one thing their science cannot measure, cannot infect, and cannot stop. The question isn't whether he'll survive, it's whether anything here can even make him care. Written by me, and if this collision lit something up in you, the next one is yours to name. Drop a universe and a character in the comments. Any world, any hero, any monster. And tell us who steps through the door next. We're listening, so lock the doors, kill the lights, and step into the dark with the strongest man alive, who is about to be profoundly, catastrophically unimpressed.
Dr. Elias Halden had been told the anomaly was stable. He clung to that word now, the way a man treading black water clings to a plank. Stable. It was written on the clearance form he'd signed 9 hours ago, in the deep sublevels beneath the Raccoon City satellite facility, 3 floors under a laundromat that did not exist. It was printed on the containment glass in front of him. It was the word his supervisor had used, twice, before going upstairs to answer a call and never coming back down. The word meant nothing anymore, and Halden knew it, because the readings on his console had stopped making the shapes that physics allowed. The anomaly itself was unremarkable to look at. A ring of matte gray apparatus the size of a truck, humming at a pitch that lived just under hearing, so that you didn't notice it until you'd been in the room an hour and your back teeth ached. Umbrella's exotic division had built it to do something the biohazard people upstairs would have called science fiction, to reach sideways, past the wall of the world, and pull material through. Not a virus, not a specimen. Umbrella had grown bored of growing horrors in glass. They wanted to import them. A weapon from somewhere the T-virus had never heard of. A shortcut past a decade of failed mutations. For 3 years, the ring had reached into the dark and come back with dust. Isotopes that didn't belong on the periodic table. Once, memorably, 4 seconds of a sound that made 2 researchers weep and one of them resign. Never a payload. The board upstairs had begun to use the word decommission in memos, and men like Halden had begun, quietly, to update their resumes. Then, at 11:04 on the night the city above them started to die, the ring caught something that pulled back. The readings didn't spike. That was the wrong word, and Halden would spend the rest of his short life failing to explain it to people who wanted the word spike. They didn't spike, they filled. Every gauge, every meter, every fail-safe designed to measure a range simply went to its maximum and stayed there, serene, as if the instruments had given up and decided to lie down. The hum under the floor climbed out of the basement of hearing and became a physical thing, a pressure on the eyes, and through the containment glass, in the center of the ring, the air folded. Halden had watched 100 hours of footage of this apparatus doing nothing. He knew what the empty ring looked like. What he saw now was the empty ring, and then a seam in the middle of it, a vertical wound in the light, and the seam parting like a held breath finally let go. And a man stepped out of it, mid-yawn. The klaxon didn't sound. That was the thing Halden's mind kept snagging on, in the last calm seconds it had. The apparatus was ringed with 100 fail-safes, and a dozen of them should have screamed. None did. The man simply walked out of the fold in the world the way a person walks out of a lift, one red boot and then the other, scratching the back of his bald head, and the fold sealed behind him without a sound, and the readings all dropped to 0 at once, and the hum stopped, and the sudden silence was so total that Halden could hear his own pulse. The man looked around the containment chamber. He took in the gray apparatus, the biohazard signage, the reinforced glass, the pale technician staring at him from behind it with his mouth open. "Huh," said Saitama. He said it into an intercom he couldn't have known was live, in a language the facility's translation subroutines flagged as 91% probable Japanese, and his voice came through Halden's console, flat and mild and monumentally uninterested. "Is this the sale?" Halden did not answer, because Halden had lost the use of his mouth. Saitama waited a polite beat. When no sale materialized, he turned in a slow circle, taking the room in a second time with the specific disappointment of a man who has walked a long way to the wrong shop. He'd been on his way to the discount supermarket. There had been a flyer, 90% off, 1 day only, and he'd been running the numbers on how many hot pots that came to when the pavement under his feet had gone strange and gray and pulled, and now here he was, in a concrete room that smelled of coolant and fear, and there was very clearly no supermarket. "This isn't City Z," he observed, to no one. Behind the glass, Halden's training finally reasserted itself the way a reflex fires in a corpse. His hand found the red comm panel. His voice, when it came, was a stranger's. "Containment. Containment, there's a subject. The ring produced a subject, a humanoid. I repeat, the anomaly is breached. Subject is ambulatory." The response from upstairs was immediate, and it was not concern. It was appetite. Later, in the version of that night that got typed into a report by people who survived it, sanitized and buried and never read by anyone who mattered, the decision would look insane. But Halden understood it even as it damned him, because he worked for Umbrella and he knew how Umbrella thought. Upstairs, the city was on fire. The T-virus had slipped its leash 6 hours ago, and Raccoon City was already lost. Men in better offices than Halden's were already drafting the memos that would end in a warhead. And into that catastrophe, in the same hour, the Exotic Division had done the one thing it had promised for 3 years and never delivered. It had reached into the dark and brought back a weapon, a living asset, walked in on 2 legs, produced no readings, sealed the breach behind itself like it was nothing. You did not, if you were Umbrella, ask such a thing whether it wanted tea. You assessed it. You tested it. And if it tested well, you owned it. The chamber's inner door unsealed with a pneumatic gasp, and 4 men came through it fast and low, Yubsk's tactical gear, rifles up, red dots crawling across the yellow of Saitama's jumpsuit. Behind them, a 5th figure entered without hurrying. Older, gray-cropped, pale-eyed, a clipboard in one hand, and a sidearm still holstered. Nikolai Zinoviev did not point weapons at things. He watched other men point weapons and wrote down what happened. And tonight what he was watching was, professionally speaking, the most interesting thing he had ever seen. "Hands!" barked the lead mercenary, in English, then in bad Russian, then he gave up on languages and jabbed the muzzle forward for emphasis. "Hands where I can see." "Do you guys work here?" Saitama asked. He raised his hands, but the way a man raises them when asked a question, loosely, palms out, not the way a man surrenders. "Sorry, is there a supermarket around? I think I took a wrong turn. There was supposed to be a sale." The lead mercenary looked at his 4 red dots sitting on an unarmed, unarmored, apparently unremarkable bald man in a costume, and made the reasonable decision. Umbrella's assessment protocol for an unknown biological asset had a first step, and the first step was to establish threat capacity. You did not learn what a weapon could take by asking it. Nikolai, behind them, had already clicked his pen. "Non-lethal," the lead man said. "Legs." 2 rifles dropped their aim and fired. At this range, into a stationary target, there was no missing. Halden, watching through the glass, saw the muzzles flash. He heard the reports slam flat off the concrete. He saw the yellow fabric over Saitama's shins twitch, and he saw the rounds stop. They did not punch through. They did not ricochet off armor, because there was no armor. There was fabric, and under the fabric there was a bored man's leg, and the bullets reached that leg and simply ceased, flattening against a surface that did not give at all, dropping to the concrete floor in little mushroomed lumps of spent copper, with 4 small, absurd tink sounds. A round had a better chance of denting the planet. Saitama looked down at the flattened bullets by his boots. Then he looked back up at the 4 men, and for the first time his flat expression shifted. Not to fear, and not to anger, but to a weary, put-upon irritation. The specific face of a man who has had a long day and did not want it to also involve this. "Hey," he said, "don't shoot people, that's rude." The lead mercenary's mouth had gone dry. He had seen a rifle round fail to break the skin of a man in a Halloween costume. His hind brain, the old animal part that had kept his ancestors alive, was screaming a single instruction, "Leave," and his training was screaming over it, and in the gap between the two he did the worst possible thing, which was nothing, for half a second too long. Nikolai, by the door, stopped writing. He was a survivor before he was anything else, and he had just watched the ground rules of the world change, and unlike the 4 men in front of him, he understood exactly what he was looking at. He took one silent step backward, toward the door, and began, with great professional calm, to reassess whose side it was worth being on. "Okay," said Saitama, "I'm gonna go find the exit." He walked forward. He did not attack. That was the detail Halden would never be able to make anyone believe, that the strongest thing anyone in that facility had ever seen did not throw a single punch. Saitama simply walked in the direction of the door, and the four armed men were between him and the door, and so he reached out as he passed the nearest one and, with the gentleness of a man moving a chair, set a red-gloved hand on the mercenary's chest plate and pushed him aside. The man left the ground. He crossed the containment chamber sideways at a speed the eye couldn't track, hit the reinforced glass of Halden's booth, and the glass, rated to stop a hunter's claws, rated to stop a great deal, spider-webbed white from floor to ceiling in a single instant, and the man slid down it and did not get up, and he was, remarkably, still breathing, because Saitama had been careful, because Saitama was always careful, because being careful was the only interesting problem he had left. The other three ran. Nikolai was already gone. The door hung open on the corridor beyond, and from that corridor, for the first time, Halden heard a sound that was not part of any umbrella protocol. Distant, wet, a low, layered moaning, dozens of throats, coming closer through the sublevels. The outbreak had reached them. The dead were in the building. Saitama paused in the doorway. He tilted his head, listening to the moaning the way you'd listen to a neighbor's television through a wall, aware of it, not troubled by it. Is that a festival? He wondered aloud. Then, from behind the fractured glass, in a voice that shook so badly it barely carried, Dr. Elias Halden said the only useful thing he would say all night. He said it because he was going to die in this building and he knew it, and because some stubborn ember of the scientist he'd been before Umbrella bought him wanted, at the very end, to warn the one thing here that might listen. It's not a festival, Halden said into the live intercom. This whole city, it's dead. The people up there aren't people anymore. They'll bite you. If they bite you, you become one of them. There's no cure. There's no help coming. There's only, his voice cracked, there's only the ones who did this, and they're going to burn the whole city to hide it. You need to run. Saitama considered this. The moaning swelled in the corridor. Somewhere above, faint and terrible, a woman was screaming, and then, abruptly, was not. Bite me and I turn into a monster? Saitama repeated. Yes, Halden whispered. Saitama looked, briefly, almost interested. Then the interest drained out of his face like water out of a cracked cup, because some ancient instinct already told him, the same instinct that had told him the bullets wouldn't matter, that nothing in this building was going to bite through skin that shrugged off rifle rounds. Nothing here could touch him. He was already, in the first 10 minutes, disappointed. Which way's up? He asked. Halden lifted one shaking hand and pointed at the emergency stairwell. Thanks, said Saitama. And then, because he was a hero, even a bored one, even a lost one, in the wrong world entirely, he added, You should come with me. It's dangerous, right? But Halden was already backing into the corner of his booth, shaking his head, because the first gray hand had appeared in the doorway behind Saitama, and the second, and the moaning was on top of them now, and the junior technician had made his peace with the fact that his warning was the last decent thing he'd ever do. Saitama turned to face the corridor as the dead of Raccoon City poured into the room, and up above them, 40 floors and one dying city away, in an office with a view of the burning skyline, a man in an umbrella uniform picked up a red telephone and asked, very calmly, how long it would take to have a missile authorized. The night had brought Umbrella a weapon that could not be scratched, infected, measured, or owned. It was about to spend that same night learning it could not be used, either. The dead came at Saitama the way water comes at a stone. They filled the containment chamber in a shuffling gray tide, dozens of them, what had been Umbrella staff and security, and one man still wearing a cafeteria apron, their faces slack and weeping, their jaws working on nothing, their throats making that low, layered moan that Halden had mistaken for a festival because his mind refused the truth of it. They reached for the warm living thing in the yellow jumpsuit with the mindless certainty of the infected, and they closed the distance, and they laid their rotting hands on him, and they bit down. Nothing happened. Teeth met the skin of Saitama's forearm and stopped, the way the bullets had stopped, and a molar the T-virus had loosened in some dead clerk's jaw simply cracked and fell out. A second zombie clamped onto his shoulder and gnawed at the yellow fabric with the desperation of the damned and achieved precisely nothing, gumming a shoulder that a tyrant couldn't have dented. Saitama stood in the center of a feeding frenzy that could not feed, wearing the mild, faraway expression of a man waiting for a kettle to boil. You guys really don't look so good, he said. He didn't hit them, That was the mercy that wasn't mercy. He understood at a glance that these things had been people, that whatever moved them now wasn't their fault, and there was no sport and no threat in a crowd that couldn't scratch him, so he didn't fight them at all. He waited. He crossed the room the way you cross a crowded train platform, turning a shoulder, stepping over the ones on the floor, gently detaching the gray fingers that snagged his cape, and the dead swirled behind him and lost him, and moaned at the empty space where he'd been. Behind the fractured glass of the booth, Dr. Elias Halden watched the impossible man walk untouched through the thing that had ended his world, and Halden began, quietly, to laugh, and then to cry, and the two came out of him as the same broken sound. He did not follow. He couldn't have kept up, and he knew what was coming for the building regardless, and he had already decided how his night ended. He watched the yellow cape disappear into the emergency stairwell, and then he turned his chair to face the door and the tide behind it, and that is the last the world saw of Dr. Halden, and he was, at the very end, braver than the corporation that owned him deserved. Saitama climbed. The stairwell went up through the sublevels and switchbacks of flickering emergency red, and he took it 2 flights at a time, not because he was rushing, but because his legs simply covered that much ground, and at every landing the door hung open on a fresh tableau of the end of the world, a laboratory where something had gotten loose from its restraints, and left the restraints and the room in ribbons. A break room where a coffee machine still cheerfully burbled beside a body that would not be drinking any. A corridor where the overhead sprinklers had triggered and rained cold water down onto the upturned faces of the dead, so that they stood in the downpour and moaned at the ceiling like a congregation. He came up out of the ground into the lobby of a laundromat that had never washed a single shirt, pushed through a fire door that said, "Emergency exit alarm will sound." No alarm sounded. Nothing in this city had the will left to sound, and stepped out, at last, into Raccoon City. And even Saitama stopped. It wasn't fear. He had no framework for fear anymore. It had bled out of his life along with everything else that used to make his pulse move. But he had a framework for wrong, and the city was wrong in a way that reached him. Rain fell through orange sodium light and drifting smoke. A police cruiser lay on its roof in the middle of the intersection, light bar still turning, throwing lazy blue arcs across wet brick and shattered glass. Every shopfront was dark or burning. A traffic light cycled dutifully through green, amber, red for no one, over a street where the only things moving were the dead. Dozens of them, hundreds, scattered up the avenue in the rain, some shuffling, some crawling, some simply standing with their faces tipped up to the water. Somewhere a car alarm wailed and wailed. Somewhere a dog barked and then didn't. Over it all, on a corporate tower 3 blocks north, the red and white umbrella logo glowed serene and enormous, presiding over the graveyard it had made. "Man," Saitama said softly, "to the rain." This is really bad. He'd fought monsters that could crack the moon. He'd traded punches with things from the center of the earth and things from above the sky, and none of it had touched the flat gray place inside him where excitement used to live. But this, a whole city of ordinary people turned into this, by other ordinary people, for money. This was a kind of bad his fists had no answer for. And something in him that wasn't bored, that hadn't been bored in a long time, turned over and paid attention. 2 blocks east, on the flat roof of a gutted pharmacy, that same instinct saved Jill Valentine's life, for the 9th time that night. She dropped the last liquor with the last 3 rounds she could spare, put them into the exposed brain meat where the skinless thing's skull had split open, watched it spasm and go still, and then stood there in the rain, with the slide locked back on an empty pistol, and did the arithmetic that had become her whole existence. Rounds remaining, none. Blocks to the eastern checkpoint, 11. Time until the thing she wasn't letting herself think about. Unknown, but close, because the UBC's men had started talking in a way that men talk when they've been told a city is going to be sterilized, and they're still inside it. "Jill!" Carlos came up the roof access hard, rifle slung, a fresh gash weeping through the shoulder of his UBC's vest that she was going to have to look at and didn't have time to. "The bridge is out. Whole span. Gone. They blew it. I think they blew it. We're boxed in this sector." He caught the look on her face. "There's more. Nikolai came up on the radio. He's alive. He's in the Western labs. And he's saying..." Carlos laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "He's saying there's a man down there. That the Ground Zero site pulled a man out of nowhere, and the man walked through a squad and through the infected, and didn't take a scratch. He wants us to help him bring the man in, for umbrella, for the bonus. Jill wiped rain out of her eyes. Nikolai's lying. Nikolai's always lying. He wants us in the open so his monster finds us instead of him. Yeah, Carlos said. That's what I said. But Jill, I heard it too. On the sub-level channel, before he cut in. Somebody screaming about a subject that doesn't read on any instrument. And then he stopped. Below them, in the street, something had changed. The moaning had shifted. The scattered dead in the intersection were all turning, all at once, the way a field of sunflowers turns, orienting on something coming up the avenue from the west. Jill moved to the parapet and looked down, and saw a bald man in a yellow costume walking up the middle of Raccoon City's dead Main Street, hands in his pockets, and the entire horde converging on him from every doorway and alley, and the bald man not changing his pace by so much as a step. That's him, Carlos breathed. That's the guy. He's dead, Jill said flatly. She'd watched this city eat harder men than one idiot in a cape. She raised a hand to her mouth to shout a warning she knew was useless, to tell him to run, to get off the street. And the first wave of the dead reached him and closed over him, and Jill's warning died in her throat, because the yellow costume did not go down. The horde swarmed the man, and the man kept walking through the horde, and where he walked, the dead came apart. Not from blows. Jill's trained eye, which had seen every kind of killing this city had to offer, could not find the blows. He simply moved, and a lane opened around him. Zombies flung aside by a shrug, a passing forearm, the mere fact of him occupying space they wanted to occupy, tumbling away broken and not rising. And the man walked up the center of the street toward the pharmacy at the exact unbothered pace he'd started with, trailing wreckage, and looked up, and saw the two living people on the roof. He raised one red-gloved hand, and, over the moaning, over the rain, over the wailing car alarm, he called up, conversationally, "Hey, you two okay up there?" Carlos looked at Jill. Jill looked at Carlos. Neither of them had a word ready for the situation. "You should get down from there," Saitama called. "The roof's not... Actually, no. The roof's probably fine. The ground's the problem." He glanced around at the dead still trying to reach him, absently caught one by the collar and set it aside without looking. "Is there a supermarket in this city? A big one?" "I really need to find a supermarket." Carlos leaned over the parapet. "A supermarket?" There was a sale. Jill Valentine had survived the Spencer mansion. She had survived the fall of everything she'd sworn to protect, watched her team die, watched her city die, and been lied to at every turn by the men who'd engineered it. Her trust was a burned building, and yet she found herself against every instinct making the calculations she made about every asset in a war zone. What does this do, and can it get me to the checkpoint? And arriving at an answer that felt like standing on ice over deep water. "Stairs," she said to Carlos, already moving. "We talked to him on the ground. And Carlos," she checked the empty pistol out of habit, holstered it, drew the knife instead. "We do not tell him a single thing about Umbrella until I know whose side that costume is on." They came down through the pharmacy and out the shattered front, into the rain, into the intersection, and the dead were still coming, always coming, from every direction. And Carlos put the rifle to his shoulder, and Jill put her back to his, and for a moment, it was the old grim math again. 2 guns and too many targets, and not enough rounds. And then Saitama stepped into the gap between the survivors and the horde, and said, "I got it," and the math simply stopped mattering. What happened next happened in under 4 seconds, and Carlos, who saw it from 6 feet away, would describe it badly for the rest of his life, because there were no words in his vocabulary or anyone's for the economy of it. Saitama did not wind up. He did not roar. He turned to the largest mass of the advancing dead, some 40 infected packing in from the north end of the intersection, and he threw one punch. A short, almost lazy jab, the kind of thing you'd throw at a punching bag you'd stopped respecting, and the air did the rest. A fist-shaped column of displaced atmosphere left his knuckles at a speed that turned it solid, and it went up the avenue in a straight line and took the north end of the intersection with it. The horde, the overturned cruiser, a post box, the front 3 meters of a shoe shop. All of it lifted off the wet street and was gone, punched clean out of the city and into the low clouds, and the rain that had been falling in that whole cubic acre of air was blown out with it, so that for one weird, beautiful instant, There was a bone-dry corridor running 4 blocks north through the downpour, walled in mist, with Saitama standing at the mouth of it, flexing the mild ache out of his knuckles. Then the rain fell back in to fill the space, and it was just a street again, emptier than before. Silence, except the alarm in the water. Carlos slowly lowered his rifle. His mouth was open. "Dios," he whispered. "Dios mío." Jill did not lower her knife. She stood in the rain and stared at the impossible man and felt the ice under her crack, not toward fear but toward something more dangerous, which was hope. And hope had gotten more people killed in this city than the T-virus. "What are you?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Saitama scratched his cheek. "Saitama," he said. "I'm a hero. For fun, mostly." He looked at the empty pistol in her hand, the fresh wound on Carlos's shoulder, the exhaustion carved into both their faces, the dead city standing over the 3 of them. Something in his flat expression softened by a degree that only a close observer would catch. "You 2 have been fighting all this by yourselves, huh?" "Something like that," Jill said. "That's rough." He said it simply, and he meant it simply, and it landed harder than any speech could have, because it was the first time in what felt like a year that anyone had said anything to Jill Valentine that wasn't a lie or an order. "Okay, where were you trying to get to? I'll walk you, then you can point me at the supermarket." Jill exchanged a look with Carlos. 11 blocks of dead city stood between them, and a checkpoint that might already be abandoned. A bridge blown behind them. A cold voice on the radio calling them into the open to trap them. And a man who had just deleted a city block with his fist and then asked, sincerely, about groceries. "Eastern checkpoint," Jill said. 11 blocks. There's an evac staging there, if it's still there. Everything between here and it wants us dead. "Cool," said Saitama, entirely unbothered, already turning to walk. "Point me." But high on the umbrella tower to the north, in the office with the red telephone, a man had been watching the whole intersection on a rain-streaked traffic camera, and he had seen a city block leave the earth, and he was no longer talking about a warhead as a distant contingency. He was talking about it as a schedule. And on the Western Channel, Sergeant Nikolai Zinoviev listened to that same conversation on a frequency he wasn't cleared for, smiled his cold, pale smile, and began to make his own arrangements. Because if Umbrella wanted the Yellow Man badly enough to move up a missile for him, then the Yellow Man was worth more than any bonus, and Nikolai had always known exactly how to profit from other people's monsters. He keyed his radio. "Valentine," he said warmly. "Oliveira, I have such good news about the Eastern checkpoint. Let me tell you exactly how to get there." They went east through the drowned city, and Saitama walked point because nothing else made sense. It made a strange procession. Jill on his left, knife out, eyes never still, reading every window and doorway the way a card counter reads a table. Carlos on his right, rifle up, calling contacts out of old habit even though the contacts no longer mattered. Left, second floor. Runner, alley. Group ahead, maybe 20. And Saitama between them, hands in his pockets, strolling, occasionally wandering 2 steps off the line to look in a shop window because he thought he'd seen a rice cooker. The dead came, and the dead were removed. He'd stopped throwing the big punches. Jill had asked him not to, in a flat professional voice, after the second one had blown the front off an apartment building and brought half of it down into the street ahead of them, because a man who could delete a city block could also, apparently, delete their route to the checkpoint. So he did it small instead. A flick of 2 fingers that folded a charging zombie backward over a parked car. A nudge of his heel that sent a crawler skidding 40 feet up the wet asphalt. Where the horde got thick, he'd simply stand in front of Jill and Carlos and let it break on him, an immovable yellow object in the current, and reach back now and then to steady Carlos when the man's wounded shoulder buckled. Somewhere in the 4th block, Carlos started talking to him. It began as nerves, the compulsive chatter of a man who narrates so he doesn't scream, but it turned into something else. Because Saitama, it emerged, was a very easy person to talk to. He asked no hard questions. He judged nothing. When Carlos, half-laughing, told him he'd signed up with the Upsies because the pay was good and the brochure had a helicopter on it, and that he'd figured out 3 days ago that the company he worked for had made the very plague he was dying in, Saitama just nodded and said, "Yeah, that's messed up. You should quit, and somehow that plainness was more comfort than sympathy would have been. Jill talked less, but she watched him, and what she watched for was the tell, the moment the asset revealed the price, the moment the too good to be true showed the catch. Every strong thing in her life had turned out to be umbrellas, in the end. She kept waiting for Saitama's logo to show. It didn't. He kept picking her a clear lane through the dead and asking, hopefully, whether the checkpoint might have a food court. The catch, when it came, didn't come from him. It came over Carlos's radio, in a warm and helpful voice. "You're making excellent time," Nikolai said. "The direct route through the Mason Street underpass. It's clear, I've eyes on it. No infected. Take the underpass. It'll save you 20 minutes, and the checkpoint won't hold forever." Carlos keyed to answer. Jill put her hand flat on the radio and shook her head. Once. "He's hurting us," she murmured. "Clear route, no infected. Take the tunnel." "That's not a helping voice, Carlos. That's a man who knows what's in the tunnel and wants us in it with it." She looked up the dark avenue toward the black mouth of the Mason Street underpass, and something old and cold crawled up her spine, an instinct she'd earned in a mansion full of monsters. He's not sending us away from the danger. He's sending us to it. He wants it to have us. Or him. She glanced at Saitama. Or you. Saitama had stopped in the middle of the road. He was looking at the underpass too, head tilted, and for the first time all night there was something on his face that wasn't boredom and wasn't mild concern. It was recognition. Some deep predator instinct in him, the one thing sharper in him than his fists, had caught a specific scent on the wind out of that tunnel. Not the rot of the dead, which was everywhere, but something made, something that had been built with purpose to end a particular kind of prey. "There's something in there," Saitama said. "Something on purpose." He sounded, for one fragile instant, almost interested, because Umbrella had, in fact, given up on the underpass being a coincidence. 40 floors up, the man with the red telephone had watched the yellow subject shrug off a rifle squad, a city block's worth of infected, and a building collapse, and had come to a corporate conclusion. If bullets did nothing and biology did nothing, then you sent the thing you built for when bullets and biology weren't enough. You sent the pursuer. You sent the one asset in Umbrella's catalog that had never in its existence been told to stop, and had never needed to be told twice to start. The Nemesis T-type had been engineered around a single directive: pursue and destroy a designated target until the target no longer existed. And tonight, with stars all but extinct, Umbrella had walked up to the towering thing and its restraints and given it a new designation. The yellow one. It was already in the underpass. It had been in the underpass for 6 minutes, standing motionless in the dark among the cars, because it had been ordered to wait until the target entered. And the Nemesis did not fidget, and did not doubt, and did not wonder why. It simply waited, rocket launcher held at rest, dead eye fixed on the tunnel mouth, coat dripping, patient as a landslide. "We don't go in the tunnel," Jill said. "Yeah, we do," said Saitama, and walked toward it. "What? That's where it wants us, right? So that's where it is." He said it with the simple logic of a man who had spent years wishing something would put up a fight. "If I go around it, it just follows you two later, when I'm not there." "Better to say hi now." He glanced back at them, and there was something almost kind in the boredom. "You two wait here. Back up, actually. Like, a lot. Go stand behind that bus." Jill did not want to trust it. Every wire in her wanted to override the strange man and take her own route and keep her own gun between herself and the dark. But she had watched him do things all night that rewrote what she thought was possible, and she made a soldier's decision to spend her trust where it might buy the most, and she took Carlos by his good arm and pulled him back behind the overturned city bus, and she watched the yellow figure walk alone into the black mouth of the Mason Street underpass. For a moment there was nothing. Rain on metal, the far moan of the city. Then a light bloomed in the tunnel. A rocket, fired point blank, its ignition throwing the whole underpass into a flat orange flash, and Jill's heart lurched. Because she'd seen what a Nemesis rocket did to a man, she'd carried the memory of it for the rest of her life. And for 1 second, she thought the impossible had finally met its limit. The explosion rolled out of the tunnel mouth in a fist of fire and smoke. Debris rang off the underside of the bus. Carlos flinched and swore, and when the smoke tore away on the rain, Saitama was standing exactly where he'd been standing, in the mouth of the tunnel, entirely on fire and entirely unbothered. patting a small flame out on his cape, with the air of a man dealing with a spilled drink. "Okay," he said into the dark ahead of him. "That one actually kind of stung. A little. Not really, but a little." The Nemesis came out of the smoke after its own rocket, because that was what it did. It never fired once and waited. It fired and it closed, always closing. The horror of it that it did not stop. 9 feet of engineered muscle in a dead man's coat, one eye lidless and fixed, and it discarded the spent launcher and came at the yellow target at a dead sprint. Faster than a thing that size had any right to move, and it drew back one enormous fist to deliver the blow that had caved in armored doors and broken things far tougher than a man in a costume, and it drove that fist forward with the full monstrous force Umbrella had built into it, straight into Saitama's face. The blow landed. It landed clean, and the Nemesis T-type stopped as though it had punched the foundations of the world. For one full second the tableau held, the towering pursuer, fist buried against the cheek of a bored, bald man who had not moved a millimeter, had not braced, had not blinked. Saitama's head had not so much as turned. And then, slowly, into the vast dead eye of the thing that had never been made to comprehend an opponent, something like the ghost of confusion crawled, the first new experience of its short manufactured existence, as it understood, in whatever passed for understanding inside it, that its target had felt nothing, and that its fist, which had never failed, had failed. "Tars?" it said, uncertain for the first time, almost plaintive. "Sorry," Saitama said. "I don't know what that means." And then, because this thing had been built on purpose to hunt and kill exhausted people like the two behind that bus, because it was the one enemy tonight that hadn't been a person once but a choice, a thing designed by men in clean offices, specifically to make survival impossible for people who deserved to survive. Because of that, Saitama actually got a little annoyed, and he flicked it. He raised one red-gloved hand and flicked the Nemesis T-type on the forehead with his middle finger, the way you'd flick a bottle cap off a table, and the pursuer that could not be stopped left the earth at a speed that turned it into a dark smear against the orange clouds, and was simply gone, punched out of the city and the story, tumbling somewhere out over the dead suburbs, terminal velocity, never to close on anything again. The rain fell into the sudden empty space where 9 feet of monster had been. Behind the bus, Carlos slid down the metal to sit in a puddle and laughed until it hurt. Jill did not laugh. Jill stood and looked at the man in the tunnel mouth and felt the last of her hard-won armor give, because she finally understood what she was standing next to. Not an Umbrella asset, not a weapon with a catch, but the single thing this city had needed for 11 blocks in 3 years and had never, ever had, something Umbrella could not out-monster, which was exactly why the man with the red telephone stopped waiting. He had watched the Nemesis fail on the traffic camera. He had watched his final asset flicked off the board like an insect. And he had reached the only decision a corporation like Umbrella ever really reaches, the one it had been reaching toward since the first infected fell. If the asset can't be owned and can't be killed, then it can't be allowed to leave with witnesses. He set down the red telephone and picked up a black one and gave a code that had been drafted hours ago and was only now, in his cold executive judgment, fully justified. "This is Facility Command. Authorization confirmed. Execute the sterilization protocol." A pause, while a voice on the other end asked the only question that mattered. "Yes, all of it. The thermobaric package, and then the warhead as scheduled. I want nothing standing in Raccoon City by dawn. No infected, no survivors, and no yellow." He looked out the rain-streaked window at the burning skyline he was about to erase. The board would rather lose a city than lose control of the narrative. Begin the countdown. And somewhere over the drowned city, an alert siren of a new and different pitch began to wind up. Not the moan of the dead, but the flat rising wail of a civil defense warning, rolling out over the rooftops, and Carlos's laughter died in his throat, because he was oopsies, and he knew that specific sound, and he knew exactly what it meant. "Jill," he said, getting to his feet, all the joy gone out of him. "Jill, that's not an evac siren. That's the purge siren. They're not evacuating the city." He looked up at the tower, at the serene glowing logo. "They're deleting it, and they just started the clock." Saitama walked back out of the tunnel, brushing ash off his sleeves. "So," he said, "was that the something on purpose? Because if there's more, He caught the looks on their faces, registered the new siren, tilted his head at it. That's a bad sound, huh? That's the worst sound, Jill said quietly. That's them burning the evidence, with us in it. The city had a clock on it now, and the clock changed everything. Jill heard it in the siren and did the math before the siren finished its first rise. A thermobaric package meant the tower would go first, a fuel-air burn to sterilize the ground zero site, and then, on whatever schedule some executive had written, the warhead to finish the rest. Minutes, not hours. And Eastern checkpoint or not, blown bridge or not, there was no longer any version of the night where you walked 11 blocks to safety, because the safe distance from what was coming wasn't 11 blocks, it was 11 miles. We can't outrun it, Carlos said. He said it flatly, a soldier reporting a fact. The laughter of 10 minutes ago scoured completely out of him. On foot, wounded, through the horde. Jill, we can't. Nobody clears the blast radius on foot. Nobody. Then we don't go on foot. Jill was already moving, already thinking, because thinking was the only thing that had ever kept her alive. Nikolai was routing us to the underpass because he wanted the Nemesis to take us, but before that, the Western Labs. He said he was in the Western Labs. Nikolai is a rat, and a rat always keeps a way out for itself. Whatever his exit is, it's fast, and it's close, and he's guarding it. She looked north, at the tower, at the black promise of it. We take Nikolai's ride. Nikolai will never. Nikolai will, Jill said, or Nikolai stays. Saitama had been quiet through this, looking up at the siren, at the tower, at the great glowing logo presiding over its own murder of 100,000 people. And something had settled in him. Not boredom, and not the flicker of fun the Nemesis had almost given him, but a third thing, older and steadier. The thing that had made him decide, years ago, to be a hero for no reason and no reward. He'd come a long way from a supermarket flyer. But the job, it turned out, was the same in any world. Where's the button? He said. Jill looked at him. What? The thing that blows up the city. Someone's got to press a button, right? Or there's a machine. Where is it? He nodded at the tower. It's up there, huh? In the tall building with the logo. He said logo the way you'd say the name of a bug you'd found in your food. The people who did all this, they're up there, and they're going to burn everyone so nobody finds out. He rolled his shoulders. Yeah, no. I'm gonna go stop that. Saitama, Jill started, and then stopped, because she had spent all night learning that the word impossible did not apply to this man, and she was not going to waste breath on it now. Instead, she made a hard soldier's calculation and gave him the only thing that mattered. The controls for a sterilization protocol won't be a button. There'll be a hardened command center near the top of that tower, reinforced, sealed, its own power. And Saitama, she caught his eye and held it. The warhead isn't in the building. Even if you stop the tower package, there's a missile coming from outside the city that they've already launched or are about to. Stopping the room might not stop the sky. Saitama considered this. Okay, he said. Then I'll do the room first, and then I'll do the sky. As if these were two errands. As if the second were not a warhead in flight. You two, go find the rat and take his ride and get out of the city. Don't wait for me. I'm faster than I look, and I don't really, he paused, searching for the word, and landed on the truth of himself. I don't really get hurt. Go. And here Jill Valentine did the hardest thing she'd done all night. Harder than the liquors. Harder than the walk. Harder than hope. She trusted him all the way. She grabbed Carlos by his good arm, and she ran west toward the labs and the rat and the exit. And she did not look back at the yellow figure turning north toward the tower, because looking back was for people who didn't believe the person behind them would be fine. Saitama went up the tower the short way. He did not take the stairs. He crouched, once, at the foot of the north face of the Umbrella Corporation's regional headquarters, in the rain, under the serene red logo, and he jumped. Not with everything. A fraction, a controlled tap of the strength that could clear low orbit, calibrated by a lifetime of learning exactly how little of himself to use. He went up the outside of the 40-story building in a single rising arc, past floor after floor of dark glass and dead offices, and he reached the command level near the summit, and he did not knock. He came through the reinforced outer wall of the hardened command center the way a thrown brick comes through a paper screen, and the wall, rated to survive the very blast it was about to trigger, burst inward in a spray of concrete and rebar and shredded steel, and Saitama landed in a crouch in the middle of Umbrella's execution chamber, amid the settling dust, stood up, and brushed off his knees. The man with the red telephone was there. So were a dozen others. Technicians, a security detail, a woman at a launch console, and for one frozen instant, the whole room stared at the bald man in the ruined yellow costume, standing in the hole he'd made in a wall nothing was supposed to breach. The security detail went for their weapons. "Don't," Saitama said, in the tired voice of a man who has been shot at enough for one evening. Something in it stopped even them. He walked past their leveled guns to the launch console, where the countdown ran in red, and he looked down at the woman operating it, who had gone white, and he asked, with terrible simplicity, "How do I turn this off?" Nobody answered. The man with the red telephone found his voice, and it was the voice of a man who had never once in his career failed to be the most powerful person in any room, reaching for the only tool he'd ever needed. "Whatever they're paying you," he said, "I'll triple it. Listen to me. Whoever you are, you have no idea what you're standing in the middle of. There are forces here beyond." Saitama put his hand through the launch console, not violently, almost gently. He pressed his palm flat to the top of the machine that was going to erase 100,000 people to protect a stock price, and he pushed down, and the entire console folded into the floor with a shriek of collapsing metal and dying electronics. Sparks fountaining, the red countdown stuttering and going black, and the tower purge sequence died in its cradle with a descending electronic moan. "The room's off," Saitama said, to no one, ticking it off a mental list. Then he looked at the man with the red telephone. "Now the sky. Where's the missile coming from? And when does it get here?" The man with the red telephone said nothing, because saying nothing was the last card he had, and he was a man who understood leverage, and information was leverage. Saitama looked at him for a long, flat moment. Then he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and he looked out at the burning city, and the rain, and the low orange clouds, and, because a lifetime of fighting things from the sky had taught him to feel their approach the way a farmer feels weather, he found it. A hard, bright point far to the northwest, dropping out of the cloud base at the top of its arc, coming down toward the heart of Raccoon City on a column of fire. Umbrella's warhead, already launched, 90 seconds out. "Never mind," said Saitama. "Found it." He opened the window by removing the wall around it, and he stepped out onto the ledge 40 floors above the dead city, wind and rain tearing at his cape, and he looked up at the descending fire the way he'd looked up at everything else all night. Meteors, kings of the deep, monsters that cracked the moon, with the flat, faraway calm of a man for whom the sky held no more surprises, and he jumped to meet it. Jill and Carlos were 3 blocks west, hauling open the hatch of Nikolai's hidden UBC's transport. The rat had been at it, of course, prepping his solo exit, and the rat had taken one look at the two of them and the knife and the rifle and made the pragmatic rat's decision that 2 allies out of the city beat 1 traitor caught in a warhead, and was even now gunning the engine when the whole sky over Raccoon City turned white. Not orange, not the fire of a detonation. White, a single clean flash high above the northern skyline, soundless for one long heartbeat, and then a crack that wasn't an explosion but its opposite, the sound of an enormous incoming thing being stopped, its energy going up and out instead of down and in. A hard, flat concussion that rolled over the rooftops and blew every remaining unbroken window in the sector into glittering dust and knocked all 3 of them flat against the transport. And then nothing came down. No fireball, no blast wave climbing the streets, no 100,000 dead made into ash. The warhead that was meant to erase the evidence of Umbrella's sins had met, high in the rain over the city, a bored, bald man's fist coming the other way, and it had simply ceased, punched out of the sky and into a burst of harmless white far above, its fury vented uselessly at the clouds. The siren wound down. The countdown was dead. The rain kept falling on a ruined city that was, against every corporate intention, still standing. Jill lay on her back in the wet street and stared up at the sky where the warhead had been, and had not been. Carlos, beside her, started to laugh again. The real laugh. The alive laugh. Even Nikolai, leaning out of the transport, said nothing at all, his cold, pale eyes fixed on the sky, and for the first time in the whole long night, the mercenary who profited from everything had encountered a thing he could not price. A minute later, a yellow figure dropped out of the low clouds and landed in the street beside the transport with a small, unremarkable thud, straightened up, and brushed some ash off his cape. "Okay," Saitama said. "Sky's done too." He looked at the three of them. Jill flat on the asphalt, Carlos wheezing with relief, Nikolai frozen in the hatch. "So the city's not gonna blow up now. The button's broken and the missile's gone." He paused, and something almost sheepish crossed his face, the anticlimax settling over him the way it always did. The old gray, familiar friend. "I don't think there's anyone left up there to send another one. I kind of broke the whole top of the building." Jill Valentine got to her feet in the rain. She looked at the man who had walked out of nowhere into the worst night of her life and, without ever once being asked, without payment, without a logo on him anywhere, had simply decided that 100,000 strangers would live. She had spent the night waiting for his catch. She understood now that there wasn't one. That was the catch. There was no catch. "Who are you?" she said. And this time it was the whole question, all of it. Saitama thought about it. The rain ran off his bald head. Behind him, the umbrella logo on the tower flickered, shorted, and went dark for good. "Just a guy," he said. "A hero. For fun." Then his stomach growled, enormous in the sudden quiet, and the faraway look came back into his eyes, and he glanced hopefully down the ruined, saved, still-standing street. "Hey! Now that the city's not exploding," he turned to them and asked the most important question he had asked all night. "Is the supermarket still open? I really think there was a sale." And Jill Valentine, Star's survivor, who had not smiled in longer than she could remember, put her face in her hand, and her shoulders started to shake, and it took Carlos a second to realize she wasn't crying. She was laughing. Above them, the rain thinned. Somewhere to the east, the first gray line of a dawn that Umbrella had sworn would never come was coming up over a city full of people who would live to see it, and did not know, and would never know, that they owed the morning to a bald man in a yellow costume who only wanted to buy discount groceries, and who, finding his world's supermarket permanently out of reach, would simply have to make do with this one. He never did find the sale, but he found a city worth saving, and two people worth walking beside, and for a man who had lost the thrill of every fight he'd ever have, that turned out, in the end, to be enough.